Hello everyone. Looks like I got a best slot right after lunch or during lunch. So I see some people are still going to continue stuff themselves with a food, and others will be in a food coma. So I probably can get away with any bullshit on this talk, right? So great. Well, anyway, we will talk about the open source cloud on this talk. And before I dive into the talk itself, let me say a few words about my perspective in this case. I was involved in open source since late 1990s. So wow, more than 20 years now, so a long time. I was an early staff member of MySQL AB. That's a company which owned MySQL database before it became Oracle product, right? And that was, I think, my first professional involvement with open source. After that, I was founder and until rather recently CEO of Percona, the company which specializes in solutions for open source databases. So that may highlight my sort of, let's say, database and data intensive applications perspective in this talk. And then I also advocate open source at large and participated as advisor, mentor, and sometimes investor in some other open source businesses as well. So if you look at my perspective itself, well, I think if you look at open source, then everything else being equal, their open source software is of course their better choice, right? It comes to you with a lot of choices, generally lower cost, more opportunities, like you can really get in the community and make that open source software better for you. Well, if you come to this conference, you probably are well aware of advantages of open source, and I have to explain those, right? Though things are rarely completely equal, right? You often find the proprietary software has some different, better usability, features, and so on and so forth. And that is where the second thing is important, right? As you think about your personal investment on your company, it's often a good idea to invest that in making open source better for you, right? Because, well, that value created becomes available for you and actually the rest of open source community forever. While if you are paying Oracle license fees, well, the only way it goes to is what the Larry Ellison, right? We don't know, can get a bigger boat as if he needs one, right? So I would encourage you to think about that. Another thing about the open source is this. Like, I really like this picture from Bruce Momjan, right? He's like from PostgreSQL community, right? Which talks about how open source and proprietary software develops, right? And often you see in various ecosystems where proprietary software comes first, right? It's really is able to build some pretty high level of features pretty quickly, and then open source software picks up typically later and grows slower. Then later on it becomes quite dominant, right? We can see that, for example, in operating systems. Right now, I am not sure if any of you have been here have a lot of experience with Oracle. With Solaris. Anyone? Well, when I was engaged with or started in my career in late 90s, right, I have a lot of folks running real operating systems, not Linux, right? Being that Solaris or Windows NT or AIX, right, and so on and so forth, right? And Linux at that point was like kind of a joke. It's kind of 32-bit operating system, doesn't really scale with multiple CPUs, right? Well, at that time, you couldn't even have a file a size more than 2 gigabytes in Linux, right? Which was, like funny limitation to speak about now. But guess, well, what now? 20 plus years later, Linux is pretty much dominant, right? And Solaris, as many other flavors of a very featureful commercial Linux, are, I wouldn't say quite dead, but kind of relegated to very niche deployments, right? And typically something which, just were deployed years ago, right, and need to be kept alive. I think there is also a lot of similarity what we can see in their developer stack, right? If you look at early 2000s, I remember I have a lot of friends at that time who would be using something like ASP.NET, right, or other Microsoft stacks popular at that time, right? And they would tell, well, look at that, how sexy and convenient that is. We have those, nice editor, graphical user interfaces, and so on and so forth, right? And what are you folks doing, like an open source folks who would be, writing Perl or PHP in something like VI? Or if you are, smart, maybe using Emacs. Right, like, completely different experience. But you know what? Guess what? Now we have the fantastic open source development platform, right? Or also like some not completely open source, but platform which empower development of open source programming languages and frameworks. And I see similar things happening now in the cloud, where we are seeing what AWS have a very integrated, sexy cloud environment, right? You can easily develop applications using all kind of those services, compared to something like using cloud native stack, which requires you to have a little bit more elbow grease, right? If you want to use it, right, by integrating, putting those things on together. Now, one thing you can think about the open source in the cloud is this idea of many cloud vendors just have an open source and make it easier to use in the cloud, right? I think that especially happens with their database technologies, right? I mean, if you're thinking to run MySQL or Postgres, right, or Elastic or something, hey, you can get those solutions in a managed form from the cloud vendors, right? We just good for you, right? That makes it easier. And I would say sort of, right? Because on the other hand, they are utilizing this old strategy, which is called embrace, extend, extinguish, right? Maybe some of you heard about those in a different context. And what the idea here is, well, we're going to take the standard, right, ubiquitous solution. We are going to extend it. Let's say as Amazon gets the Amazon Aurora, which is better MySQL or better Postgres, right? And then the idea is when people are going to be using that technology, it will be very hard for them to go back and use the truly open source solution, what that solution was based on. Now, where that solution, I think, is specifically applied those days, right, is usability and ease of use, right? I think that is the most important area, because if you think about the power of a service we have, right, there versus their application they're building, in many right, and features of various open source software, it is actually pretty high out there, right? And it's not like when you especially start and build with small developers, you will be limited by performance. What, let's say PostgreSQL is not going to perform as fast, and you really need, some proper database to do that. Well, but usability may be that limiting factor. And I think what is interesting, especially as a trend, what has been happening in our industry, in technology industry, over the last, decade plus. we are seeing software explosion, right? There is an app for pretty much everything, right? I mean, if you look at the businesses, right, or in a personal use, right, you will see people are using, tens and more, different tools on a regular basis, right? And that just, continues to grow. We also have a data explosion, right? We, in the end, have more and more data being captured, processed, right, for good and for evil, right? But, well, it just happens, right? And we have to do that with less skills, at least skills in an average, right? Because with that amount of stuff needs to be done, we need a lot of software engineers and other kind of technologists, which in many cases would not be those, whiz kids, right, who dreamed, right, about being software engineers since we were 3 years old. In many cases, we have people going in the industry right after, coding camps, right, or something, just because that is a good trade. Well, I mean, it's kind of paid pretty well most of the time, right? And you tend to have to touch shit as part of your job, right? So that's also like a benefit. So that is a good industry to go in. Now, what is interesting with that, though, as it applies to the cloud, is we are seeing increasingly what the those skills, they can be very cloud specific, right? Like somebody can come and say, oh, you know what, I am expert, I can do Postgres, right? But what that means is, well, they can deploy and manage Postgres if that takes 2 clicks in Amazon cloud environments, right? But if you tell, hey, you know what, here's the server, can you please set up a proper PostgreSQL cluster? No, right? Well, in this case, of course, you understand the problem, right? Because even there is some relationship to open source, but you are having that particular lock-in situation with a cloud, which is, never good. So this, I think, is where it also connects very interesting with what's going on with the cloud vendors. Because the cloud vendors generally push UA to use their proprietary solutions as best practice. Amazon is not going to tell you, roll your own Postgres. No, they're going to tell you the best idea is to use either Aurora Postgres or even better, something like DynamoDB, right? Which is, super scalable and yada yada, solves all the problems in the universe, right? Now, what is also interesting in this case is what the cost differentiator continues to grow, right? If you look at the price of a RDS versus, let's say, your base infrastructure cost, it was like maybe about 40% when it started. Now it's more than a double on the latest generations, right? And also, what is interesting in the cloud is what's scaling by the credit card is basically embraced, right? They're in the old-time data centers because getting the bigger box was often hard and expensive, right? The teams were often pushed to squeeze more from that hardware to get that optimization skills because they just don't have any choice. In the cloud, you can swipe your credit card and then get the larger instance. So we see from our side a lot of applications are very poorly optimized in the cloud, right, and running very large footprint, many times more than they actually need, even if some basic optimizations applied. Another trend which is interesting, I think, is how venture-funded open source have been playing this case. You can probably see what many venture-funded companies, right, they play this very interesting game, right? First, you go out, you have this kind of open source software, you engage with community, you say with the right words, right? And then they say, oh, we didn't know about the cloud. We now cannot compete with those nasty cloud vendors, right? So why don't we go ahead and change our license to something which is not open source, right? To protect ourselves. Kind of having this now kind of classical bait and switch game, I would say, right? And in many cases, and what particularly annoys me, right? This is also played with some, language like when Elastic change license to non-open source, they're saying they're doubling down on open. Oh my, right? I mean, when you have to do shitty thing, can you be at least open about that? Yes, I'm the executives. My board told me change a fucking license, or we'll find another CEO, so I don't have any other choice. Okay, I get it. Things happen. You know what? But doubling down on open, come on, that's not what's happening here. Now, what is interesting in this case is that is a very, very different game happens in, I would say, community-driven open source, right, in this case, because community-driven open source often actually speak up with cloud vendors. For example, in our database space, PostgreSQL gets a lot of love from cloud vendors, right? And they actually like it because a lot of people come in PostgreSQL ecosystem. And there in the past, maybe somebody like EnterpriseDB was biggest dog and was sponsoring a lot of PostgreSQL developer. Now you see Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they hire a lot of PostgreSQL engineers to make PostgreSQL better. And I don't just mean like the PostgreSQL better on Amazon, right, or their cloud. I mean generally better, right? And that is, I think, how things is interesting in the open source, in a community-managed open source, right? Because in this case, as the biggest sponsors change, community still can be getting stronger, right? And doesn't need to be, reacting that in the same way. Now, if you think about the business, what had been happening, I think, over the last decade, was focus on growth at any cost. And it was kind of interesting for us as we talked to many customers, say, hey, do you guys understand those things, what you have like obscene cloud costs and lock-in, so they're actually going to skin you alive later? They say, well, we don't give a shit, right? The capital is cheap right now, we need to grow as fast as possible. Right, and the cost is not the biggest concern, right? And many of in terms of startup valuations, the stock market rewarded a lot of that behavior, right? So there was not a lot of appetite to take a harder road, right, and kind of put a little bit more of elbow grease, which open source required. Also, because clouds themselves, they're investing a huge amount in their growth, right? A lot of that was put into providing the startups the first dose of heroin for free. Well, what I mean in this case is they would get some of those sponsored cloud credits, right, as long as you spend them on a particular cloud, with hope what it would be too painful to move for your startups to move to other clouds later on, right? Now, as you all probably know, over the last few months, maybe getting close to a year now, things have been changing right now, right? With raising raise, right? The capital is not as cheap anymore, and there is a lot more focus on that, almost forgotten word called profitability, right? Like, well, you know what? If you're in business, maybe you should remember you should be making money, just maybe. We can see now what people are talking about cloud being expensive, right? Like, I like this article by actually Anderson Horowitz, right? One of the prominent VC firms, which talks about, wow, cloud is freaking expensive. If you look at your costs for some companies, right, that's maybe, close to half or more than half of their cost of revenue, right? Or you see a number of companies, but I would highlight here particularly, 37 Signal, because they are kind of very brutal, direct, right? And I like their directness, right, and transparency. They say, hey, you know what? We found out the cloud is, freaking expensive for us, and we can save a lot of money by doing that. And they talk about, well, single millions, right, which is not a lot of enterprise space. Since that, I've seen some other articles where some, Singapore companies saying, hey, we actually think we spent $400 million, right, by having some workloads at our own data centers, right? So I think there is a lot more attention to that now. Another thing which I find interesting as a new trend is the GitOps and declarative version infrastructure as a code, right? And why is that important? Because if you have built your deployment pipeline and you simply commit how things have to be deployed, right? Maybe as like some YAML file, right? You don't need a lot of that fancy GUI what your Amazon and other clouds provided, right? And in many cases, actually, that is where the open source tooling can be quite superior, right? That is where Amazon and others had some catching up to do, right? And some of you may remember what Amazon had their own, container engine, right? Before they say, well, actually, Word is standardizing on Docker, and then they had to kind of catch up to add the Docker support, right, as a, Elastic Kubernetes service or AKS later on. We also see interesting trend in terms of a hybrid cloud adopted, right, especially by the larger enterprise. And if you have a multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, and so on, right, that changes things, right? That means, if I build a lot of applications relying on technologies only available on on AWS or only on Azure, right, or something, well, that makes it more problematic, right? Then I have to move things around. Some of that I think also plays in an interesting things in the politics, right, in a different countries, and that is one of the reasons multinationals may need to play these games, right? Like, for example, I remember talking to folks in Turkey. Well, in their case, not a lot of organizations are allowed to deploy things in the cloud, especially like nobody from financial industry is allowed to do it. So if you have if your organization which does business in Turkey, well, guess what, right? You need to make sure your technology can operate according to that company regulations. Well, I started by showing that example of what have been happening with the development frameworks, right? But I think I want to go back here and highlight what we see that open source recently is catching up again. As I will see, there is a lot of momentum, in particularly in cloud native computing foundation, right? I'll kind of blow up that little image in this case just to show how much stuff, companies, components, services, right, right, and mostly open source, right, at least open core, which are members of that foundation. In fact, I think in many cases there's like too many. There's like too many choices, too many ways to do the same thing. But you know what? That is actually how open source innovation happens, right? We tend to have multiple ways of doing the same stuff. Then, all of them sort of explore different paths in parallel, right? And then they can sometimes unite the forces, sometimes something dies off, right? And smaller amount remains. That is pretty cool. Now, I don't think that is only cloud native foundation, right, which is which is doing that, right? So that's obviously like Kubernetes focused. That's one approach, but there are a couple of others technologies in this space, right? Even on the high level, right? Also making open source in the cloud much more useful. With that, though, you may wonder if I am against the cloud, saying, hey, you know what, we just have to, kill the cloud and go back in our caves and sit by the fire pits. No, I'm not suggesting that. What I think is what there is different ways to use the cloud. And in this case, I think it's very good to look at this picture, which is not my picture, right? You can see, it is actually the picture from the Amazon presentation, maybe like a 15 odd years ago, when they have been introducing the cloud. And they have been introducing the cloud by comparing that to electricity, saying, hey, you know what, folks, you understand, right? Yes, in certain cases it may make sense to have your own generator, but for most of us, it's easier and more convenient to just buy utility power, right? The same applies with servers, right? Another infrastructure environment. Why would you want to do that? Let that somebody else to happen. Well, and that makes sense. But then what Amazon is doing, what they are a lot of focus right now, right, is also to make sure they sell your TV, your fridge, your microwave, and they only will work if you're buying power from them, right? That does not make much sense to me anymore, right? And that is where I think what we can do is to say, hey, clouds is very wonderful solution, which we can use that for to provide us as a commodity infrastructure provider, and we are using the open source as that layer where we differentiate and really build value, right? I think that is their way to use the cloud, right? And that is, as I would define those two ways, right? Like one is what you can really use the cloud, right, with lock-in, right? When you say, hey, you know what, I'm going to drink AWS Kool-Aid, exactly do everything the fair, well-architectured infrastructure, and will use as many of those proprietary AWS services as possible, and then, have to pay them any ransom, right, they will want to take through years, right? Or I can really use a cloud as commodity infrastructure provider and use open source. And if this cloud doesn't work for me for any reason, I can move it. If I need to run some stuff on-prem for whatever reason, I can do it. Now, in this case, I think a question becomes is what exactly would you be using as an API for that, right? The challenge, I think, in this case for a lot of folks is obviously we have Linux. It is kind of wonderful when you operate in the context of the same server. But then if you want to manage many servers, right, then that becomes kind of more, problematic, right? Managing VMs directly, especially, spinning them up, and managing, network infrastructure and so on and so forth, right? There is a lot of kind of proprietary stuff out there, right, which is not very convenient to use. Right? But what we have in this case is a Kubernetes, which really increasingly abstracts away a lot of that challenge, providing you a great unified API. Some people coming from Linux love Kubernetes. Some kind of hate it because it's kind of like, in many cases, different, programming model, right, in this case. But the thing we have to give to Kubernetes, it has been growing very fast, and it is pretty much ubiquitous, right? I mean, Kubernetes exists everywhere on all major cloud providers. You can have it on-prem, you can have it on the edge, anywhere. And then there's a lot of improvements which are happening in the Kubernetes land, especially, again, I will highlight like my database perspective in this case. Like, for example, the storage interface, CSI in Kubernetes, is a very important addition, allowing you to interface with all those like a different storage interface providers which exist in the unified way. Because if you're thinking about the databases, well, you need to provision the storage, you need to scale that, you need to do many things with storage, right? Which is important if you're not just thinking about, hey, stateless compute application. Over the last few years, we also see this data on Kubernetes, or DOK Community, was created and pretty active, right? And that highlights that there is a lot of critical mass and interest of running data-intensive applications on the Kubernetes, which I think was that sort of like the last thing, right? Because if you think about solution which was initial solution Kubernetes, right, which was initially created for stateless application, the data stuff, the databases, which is actually where your state is, right, that's sort of like on complete opposite of a spectrum. What is interesting in this case, though, and in this case, that is data from CNCF, right? So it's not, what could be self-serving data on Kubernetes community survey, all right, is this. They did a survey about, hey, what exactly, where do we see the growth of a usage of application? And you can see what the databases are the second, right, fastest growing area, right? And we can see that the usage of a Kubernetes user, so for Kubernetes to run a database, grew by almost 50% in just one of a year, right? Which is, tremendous growth in that, what I would think like a last frontier of a classes of applications for Kubernetes. What I also find interesting is what, if you look at a lot of database as a service solutions, like, and let's say it's like maybe smaller database as a service solutions which were launched in the last several years, a lot of them are powered by Kubernetes, right? Like, and I list some here, and these are only people who spoke publicly about hey, what they actually use Kubernetes in the infrastructure. I think there's a lot of other ones doing the same, right? They may not just talk about that. I also mentioned what the Kubernetes is available anywhere, and I think what there's also cool work going on in usability, right? I think as example of K3S is this like a lightweight Kubernetes distribution you can easily roll out. That is fantastic, right? Because what we want to make sure of Kubernetes, what it does not become open stack, right? Which may be wonderful, but if you need a team of 100 people to run something, then that's really hard to achieve a kind of broad adoption, right? Outside of like a relatively small set of organizations who can afford that. I think it's also great to see what we are getting more of at GUI applications integrated with Kubernetes. Because yes, some people just say, hey, CLI, that's all I need. I don't need that graphical mumbo jumbo, right? Like command line, I see some numbers and that works for me. Well, other people would like to have a visual presentation of your whatever, like a performance data, have some, visual presentation of your infrastructure and so on and so forth, right? And that is being developed. We are also seeing there is development of application catalogs, which I think is another thing which is a very important, right? It's like something like a marketplaces which exist in the cloud, right? Or we got used to those like app stores, right, on our phone, right? And they already existed, for example, for folks like like Red Hat OpenShift, right? But it is very nice to see what we are getting number of stores right now which exist for just normal open source Kubernetes, right? And I think that will be a fantastic next step towards making Kubernetes easier to use for focus, helping that kind of to shift more apps in that open source cloud. So what is next? Where I would like to see things going, if you like. Well, one thing I think which is continue very important, I think that's a lot of game right now, is better integrations, right? That is something which you often get in the cloud, like, oh, you know what, I deployed X and I already have something looking at security of this application, and there's data magically available in CloudWatch, and so on and so forth, right? Oh, and I can really in a couple of clicks get my data shipped to S3, right, to some analytical engine, right, wherever. We want to make sure, right, that there is some integration and interoperability within apps. It happens in some cases, right? Like, for example, observability I mentioned. There is a lot of very good tooling where you can say, hey, you know what? We have many applications which would essentially expose the data to Prometheus, which will be automatically discovered, and then there's a bunch of observability stuff which will automatically detect what is running, what is available, right, and really kind of provide you that integrated observability experience, right? In some cases, that is not completely well. We still need to continue working on usability. I found that is often very challenging for open source engineers, right, especially good ones, right? Because often if you are part of that 1%, you often don't think as an average person, right? And the things which may be easy for that average person, right, may be not even understood, right? Hey, you know what? Oh, that's obvious, right? Of course, that is, right? And I think that is a very very important, right, to for developing the team to kind of think about that. In certain, I would say, like a commercial development team, right, you often have like a product managers who would say, well, we need to really look at how customers think about that, talk about that, right, and wherever. Some open source projects were kind of done by developers for developers. They don't particularly even have that kind of role, right? But really to have software to be used by masses, we really need to understand not only about what their needs are, but what the needs are by people who are not as experienced as we are, as smart as we are, or simply kind of spending most of their time in other stuff, right? Like, for example, with databases, we see like you may have somebody who is kind of very smart researcher, right, who just needs to store some of his stuff in a database, right? Well, we're not speaking about like somebody stupid, right? They're just speaking somebody who is for whom a database is just a just a tool. Okay, and then the last thing which is specific to the databases I would mention is the day 2 operations, right? One thing about the day of your stateless application and a stateful applications like databases, they're in stateless application, you can always say, oh, just blow out everything and restart it from scratch, right? That's kind of easy, right? Like in this case, like that's how a lot of web apps can be deployed. Hey, you know what? We just deploy the stuff from scratch, right, and slowly draining the old versions, nice and clean. Well, that does not work with database, because database need to keep all that data, your stuff into that in over the last 10 years, right? And it should not lose any single transaction, hopefully, right? And we probably want that to be stay up all the time, right? So database, they spend like vast majority of your time in that what we call a day 2. After the database was deployed, when it's being managed, backup, maybe scale, scale up, scale down, upgrade, maintenance, right? All that kind of stuff, right? And if you look at the Kubernetes tooling, right, often it's not very robust, I would say, in that regard. Okay. So if you stuck here up to here with me, then I have my call for action to pitch, if you will. Well, obviously, I would encourage you to embrace the open source approach to the cloud deployment in any way you can. In particular, I think it's very helpful for the new applications, right? Because often it's kind of a very kind of hard sell if you already built something which relies on DynamoDB and simple queue service, right, and all their stuff, right? But then you have a choices of building a new stuff, right? That is how you can avoid creating that dependencies, and that is also how, in many cases, you win in mindshare. Because if you build an application on open source stack in the cloud, it works beautifully, it works wonderfully, then other folks in the company like me say, well, actually you can do it, right? Because it's kind of so funny in open source, and I think many of you may have the same similar experience, right? People tell you what something is impossible, and you've been doing that like for many years. Right? I have heard so many people say, no, but you cannot really run the bank on Postgres, right? You need Oracle for that. I say, yeah, well, you know what? It's kind of, I know so many banks, right, which are running on Postgres, right, and doing just fine. Well, obviously invest your time, right, and encourage your company organization to invest in making open source better, and also spread the word.